Game development can be an absolute nightmare. I think we sometimes forget how much has to go into making these things. So many different fields of work have to come together and make a level of quantity that would already be a lot for their own art forms, and then manage to put it all together seamlessly into a single product. That's not even mentioning the hell that is budgeting a large project like a game. With a process this complicated and with so many moving parts, it's no wonder that games can have really rough development cycles. Delays are super common to see these days, and will always manage to ruffle some feathers. No one likes waiting long for a product they really want to experience. But this is usually only a couple of extra months or maybe a year to wait, which is small in terms of development, so it's never that bad, right? Well, that's where development hell enters the picture. Some games have rough development and have to wait a bit longer. Others get rough development and then are plunged into the very pits of hell. This is the worst place for a game to find itself in. Development hell makes no one happy. Players aren't happy to wait for little ages. It usually implies the development team is going through an awful state, and there's no guarantee that the wait will be worth it, as development hell can really show with some games' quality. Some games are completely lost to development hell, and either end up never coming out, or showing all their scars with poor quality. But some can actually escape the long development cycle, and deliver great experiences, like Amori, which took 6 years and had some controversy during that, managed to come out and be a great game, or, the topic of today's video, Psychonauts 2. Psychonauts 2 is the long-awaited sequel to the cult classic 3D platformer made by Double Fine, now with production help from Microsoft. The original Psychonauts was an incredible 3D platformer for its era. While it didn't excel at pure platforming or combat like its contemporaries, it made up for it in terms of personality. The game involved jumping into people's minds to face their inner demons and solve their problems, and this premise opened the door for amazing levels. Everything is so unique with the game's different worlds, from their structure to their visual design, and all of it reflects the characters whose heads you're exploring. These levels can change wildly from straight platforming challenges to something more resembling point-and-click adventure. You never know what you'll get with these. You become very intimate with the cast of this game, and their stories are filled with humor and loads of personality. The game's main plot can be basic, but you get small stories of the individual characters, whether in their minds or just by exploring around. Everyone has a story to tell, no matter how small or silly it may seem. This is the real draw of Psychonauts, seeing what weird thing the game will do next, or what the next character's story will be. This is all backed with the wonderful score and crazy looking visuals. This is a game that everyone loved and still does. Well, except for when it came out. The game didn't do so great financially when it released. It may have just been because of other titles coming out at the time, or perhaps the game was just too wild for most people back then. But either way, the prospects for Psychonauts didn't look great despite the game leaving room for a sequel. But then, the game was re-released on digital platforms like Steam, and this reignited the interest in Psychonauts. The game sold like hotcakes on these platforms, giving it the success it deserved from the start, with nearly 1.5 million copies sold total. The Steam re-release is really what dragged Psychonauts back from the grave, as in 2015, the unbelievable happened. Psychonauts 2 was announced. Well, sorta. The initial announcement was actually for a crowdfunding campaign on Fig, which managed to reach its goal of 3 million. And so, the game entered into development, which ended up taking 5 to 6 years. The game's development ended up rocky, not because of internal struggle or lack of budget, but it seems to be because the budget going higher than they expected. As the game bounced between publishers, ending up in the hands of Microsoft, the budget grew and grew as they were able to expand the scope of the game, At one point, they needed to cut the bosses for budget, but when Xbox picked them up, they took the time to add every single one back into the game. The release date marched from 2018 to 2019 to 2020, and finally to 2021. We weren't left dry for info or content that time though, as Double Fine gave as much update on the project as they could, and also released another Psychonauts game. A VR-only tie-in! Yeah, fans were a little miffed over Rhombus of Ruin, but it gave them extra budget and time to make the game which we finally have now. Psychonauts 2 is finally here on PC, Xbox, and PS4. The game picks up where the last game left off with Rasputin, the runaway circus psychic, now coming to the HQ of the Psychonauts, an elite team of psychic agents. And now, he must sort out the remaining question of who kidnapped the head of the agency and uncover the deeper mysteries of the Psychic Six and his own family. The game is a 3D platformer just like the first game. You'll be exploring the overworld, speaking to characters, and hopping into the minds of those same characters for the main levels of this game. Here, you conquer platforming challenges in combat with their inner demons to solve their problems and uncover their past. The game holds the same charm as the first, and gives us almost everything we could have asked for. It tells an absolutely amazing story full of great laughs and heartwarming moments. Not to mention this new installment improves upon everything, now making the gameplay an absolute blast. It brings together story, visuals, and gameplay into a perfect mix to show us the amazing world and characters of Psychonauts. So, without further ado, let's dive into this psyche and talk about Psychonauts 2.
We hope you don't mind Poppins.
Psychonauts' visual style is one of its most defining features, aside from the writing and strange level design. The game shies away from the traditional cartoony design, in favor of much stranger designs with odd misshapen characters and uneven terrain everywhere. It ends up allowing these characters to truly stand out from one another, and makes the player really remember each of them, even if it's only for how strange they looked. The game doesn't just keep it to characters, as this strange deformed look seeps into the world design, which not only does the same effect of making them be very memorable, but also opens the door for interesting level design along the way. But it's not perfect in terms of visuals. Nothing from that era really is anymore. While it has held up surprisingly well, the graphics have still aged technically with low quality textures and undetailed models. And that's where Psychonauts 2 comes in. If there's one thing that always stood out even from the trailers, it's how absolutely gorgeous this game manages to look. This is the perfect upgrade of the original game's style, as now everything has that modern era polish. Every model looks so detailed, areas no longer stand out with their repeating textures, and my goodness, the way the lighting looks in this game. But the most incredible thing is just how they managed to pull off an upgrade like this without destroying the style and charm of the original. Admittedly, the strangeness of the designs is toned down for the overworld characters, but for major characters and those in the mines, everything is still its abstract self, and it's just surprising how these cartoony designs manage to blend so perfectly with these modern realistic touch-ups. The new tech with lighting manages to let these designs look even better with how the colors now just pop. As always with these reviews, I suck at describing how good things look, so just, God, look at this game! And beyond the character design being touched up, the worlds now are even more amazing than they were before. I do love Whispering Rock and the Asylum, but the new areas of Psychonauts 2 absolutely blow them out of the water in terms of design. The Mother Lobe is the perfect starting area for this game, as it begins to slowly open up more and more as you clear the tutorial parts of the game. It manages to feel like somewhere truly important, while also having that element of claustrophobia from a crowded office building. There are plenty of places to explore around in, but they're also separated and distant from each other. but that quickly changes when you start exploring outside. The outside areas like the quarry are absolutely brimming with life, and just look gorgeous with the modern graphics. A far cry from Whispering Rock, these places feel like actual places. But while the quarry looks great, the questionable area blows it out of the water with its pure charm. This area is absolutely a standout part of this game, as it has a similar vibe to Whispering Rock, but elevates it with its own brand of strangeness, with both the actual unnatural aspects of the area and the absolute absurdity of the fake exhibits and advertising gimmicks. It ends up being a really great hub area despite you really not needing to visit there much. You'll still find yourself here for hours with just how fun of a place it is. But Psychonauts is not a game about the physical world. It's about the inner minds of the characters, and they bring their A game to make each of these mental mazes mesmerizing. Psychonauts has always gone completely crazy with their mental levels, and they keep that habit for the sequel. But now they have the graphics to pull off even crazier ideas. I could gush about how perfect the concepts for these levels are all day. You'll be going between office spaces mixed with nightmares of teeth, to a massive whirlpool of letters heading straight for the fire, to a psychedelic dreamscape straight of a 60s rock album cover, mixed with the various human senses. No two levels ever feel the same here, as they all go in wildly different directions with their theming, color, structure, and sometimes even art style in some ways. This game also improves upon the original, with these levels now going much more abstract with how they're built, providing truly impossible spaces. The original did do this rarely at times, but now these impossible spaces are on full display, and add to the out there feeling of these levels. They just end up looking so gorgeous with these truly dreamlike landscapes that leave you blown away with the sheer creativity on display here. If you just stop and take in the sights, it's something else with this game. And everything is topped off with the incredible score still provided by Peter McConnell. They did an amazing job with the first OST, which provided so many memorable tracks such as Mila's Dance Party, Glorious Theater, Black of Utopia, and the PTSD-inducing Meat Circus. But McConnell managed to clearly hone their skills in the period between both games, and it shows with this OST. Every single track in this game is such a joy to listen to. None of them ever get old for me. There's such a good mix of genres here, and each is pulled off absolutely perfectly. From the chilled out rock of Psy-King, to the big jazzy band of the Lady Luctopus, to the Eastern European sound of the Aquados. It's not an OST I'm dying to listen to like other games I love, but it's one I can easily listen to with the sheer variety and amazing composition here. But it does have its standout tracks such as Lady Luctopus, Compton's Cook-Off, and the absolute standout moment of Cosmic Eye, which is both an amazing song that I have stuck in my head forever, but is also a perfect moment I will not dare to spoil for those who haven't played it. But the presentation isn't the only thing that aged from the original. Let's see what the sequel did for the gameplay as well.
We hope you don't mind Poppins.
Psychonauts 1 managed to stand out with its incredible writing, unique visual style, and out-there level design. You may have noticed that the core gameplay of platforming and combat aren't any of those, and that's for good reason. As much as I love Psychonauts, it has quite a few flaws with its gameplay. The game came from an era where every single platformer needed a combat system for some reason, and to give Psychonauts some credit, it's not a bad system, just nothing great at all. The combat just ends up feeling a bit flat and boring, as you really can only just stop dead in your tracks to either shoot or punch very basic enemies. There are some other powers you could try to use, but they're either way too situational or too slow to be usable at all. the fights just end up feeling very, very samey, as there's only one way to handle them, and that one way is slow, tedious, and not very fun. And don't think the platforming is perfect either. With how old this game is, it should be obvious that it has some jank to it. The overall feeling of controlling Raz could be better, and some controls such as tightropes could be a lot better than how they ended up implemented. Not to mention that there's not that many true platforming challenges, as the levitation ability straight up breaks a lot of them. Psychic powers in general are another problem, as despite that being the main draw of the game, not too many are truly that great. The main ones of Psyblast and Levitation feel great to use, but ones like Telekinesis and Pyrokinesis are just way too slow, and others such as Shield and Invincibility are so situational that they may as well not really be in the game. The whole roster of abilities that are supposed to be one of the main draws of the game just feel lackluster. Thankfully, these problems don't hold the game back as much as they sound like they do. Psychonauts is not a game focused on challenging combat or perilous platforming. It's much more about solving puzzles and just enjoying the writing. So these problems end up being more just minor hiccups. But even in this framework, there are still huge areas of the game that are not at their full potential, and if improved upon, the game could be so much better. Needless to say, Psychonauts 2 had its work cut out for it. But oh boy, did it manage to deliver, and fix nearly every single issue that the first game had. Starting with the platforming, Raz feels so much better to control than ever before. They feel a lot less floaty now, and their jumping is much better than the weird kind of flow that the double jump had in 1. Things overall just feel much quicker and more snappy than they did in 1. And this has also helped with the level design, that makes jumps and other challenges much more tight and challenging, instead of 1, where it felt like you did almost nothing, or it was absolutely infuriating with how clunky the challenge felt. The flow of Psychonauts 2 is much better, and instead feels like real platforming challenges that keep you focused and always feel fair and forgiving. And the way that psychic powers are brought into the platforming is also really great. Psychonauts 1 already has many problems with its psychic moveset, but one of the biggest is that basically none get used for platforming except levitation. But that's a can of worms we'll open in a bit. All of them are either combat, with big air quotes for many of them, or simple puzzle solving. Meanwhile with Psychonauts 2, we get a much better blend, with plenty still being mostly for combat, but now the new ones introduced are much more platforming based. Mental Connection and the Time Stop both have great uses for combat, but they really shine in spicing up platforming challenges. They aren't as dynamic of powers that I usually want for my platformers, but they add enough variety to the level design that they are well worth their inclusion. From needing to line up your time stops to make a safe path, or just making a moving platform more manageable, to zipping across areas with Mental Connection, and sometimes saving your skin with a grapple. These are both great powers, but they pale in comparison to your third platforming ability, Levitation. In the first game, Levitation was kinda completely broken. It felt so fun to use with how fast it made you and how high it let you jump, but goodness did it completely break most platforming challenges by letting you jump both super high up and far away. That's not even mentioning how the balloon could completely remove the challenge of lining up landings. It was amazing in terms of game feel, but it broke any potential for challenging level design most of the time. But in Psychonauts 2, they gave this power a complete makeover, like a lot of the original ones. Now it feels amazing to use, and also allows for even better level design than before. Part of the original problem was that Levitation had basically no downsides to use in most cases, but that's been changed here. The first is that Levitation no longer takes you as high. But this isn't just a nerf, as the high jump is split into a separate move you have to charge up. This makes it harder to cheese things, as you have to remain still for a while, and also have it right above you to grab, which can be hard to pull off due to the second change. The ability feels a lot more physics-based now. While it could be slippery in 1, it still felt like it didn't respond to the environment and slopes as much as it should. In 2, the ball physics feel much better, and you really will pick up speed, and go more with the environment than your own control. So if you have uneven surfaces for platforming, it's usually best to turn off levitation so you don't slip off and die easily. This fixes the problem from 1, where you basically never need to turn off levitation most of the time, and the power is more situational here. And lastly, the hover has been wonderfully balanced in the same way, as instead of being able to be used for a really long time like before, it's a very short hover to save your skin or just barely line up a jump most of the time. You can only get long levitations from using air currents, which makes for very fun set pieces whenever you get to basically fly like this. And all of these amazing controls are combined with incredible levels. While most of their diversity comes more from their visual design, they still manage to stand out with the incredibly unique challenges they throw at the player. The structure doesn't wildly vary between stages like it did in Psychonauts 1, aside from a few exceptions like Compton. Most are a lot more of just linear challenges through smaller sub-areas while exploring and solving puzzles. This does lose a bit of the charm the first game had with its later levels, but I think it manages to make up for it both by telling stronger stories, which I'll get to in a bit, and also the platforming and combat being solid enough to carry the stages without gimmicks or many puzzles. Each stage has small mechanics and challenges to call their own, and nothing that completely shakes up the formula, but just enough to feel like they're not all the same challenge, repackaged in different ways. They'll ask for mastery of different skills and abilities from each other. Apologies that I can't really say anything big about the level design in this game. It just really doesn't have the same gimmicks that 1 had, and thus they're a bit harder to talk about in a gameplay sense without just saying, it's good. But they all manage to be excellent levels with the perfect level of difficulty. But like I mentioned, platforming isn't the only thing on display with Psychonauts. Levels will be a mix between the platforming challenges I talked about, and also combat sections with various manifestations of the mind's issues. As I said before, Psychonauts 1's combat isn't bad, but it sure as heck wasn't good. From how it slowed the game's pace down so much due to how most powers required you to be at a standstill, to how thoughtless it could be since Psy Blast and punching is basically the only viable option, as other powers are either too time consuming or situational to be used in these fights, to how old it gets due to there only being 3 enemy types that are introduced from the start of the game, and you never get new ones. It's no wonder the combat feels tedious at best. I don't think combat was a thing anyone looked forward to with Psychonauts, but somehow despite that, the combat in Psychonauts 2 managed to be honestly one of the best parts of the game. This is a huge surprise for me, as I was expecting it to not be that bad anymore, but nowhere near this good. So, let's break down why this combat is so incredible compared to other platformers. The first and possibly biggest factor for it feeling so fun to fight enemies is just how it doesn't slow down the pace at all. Combat from the first game and other platformers of that era meant you had to stop in your tracks to deal with enemies. It was a huge departure from the other gameplay you did moments before. But in 2, they managed to keep a wonderful sense of flow, as combat is now just as fast paced as the rest of the game. This is due to the combat being much more movement based now. You'll find yourself using everything you just used for platforming to duck and weave around the battlefield to take out enemies, and this makes the combat and platforming feel so much more connected, instead of 2 separate styles of gameplay just slapped together. The improvements made to abilities also let the combat shine. No longer do you have slow, clunky abilities that are nearly impossible to use quickly in combat. Now, all the abilities are quick and snappy to use, and that includes old abilities as well. Pyrokinesis and telekinesis have gotten completely rehauled, and now are a blast to use in combat for taking out groups over time, or taking out enemies with their own weaponry. Nothing feels clunky anymore, and nothing feels too situational either. No matter what the ability is, it will still have some use in combat, such as time stop being a useful way to get extra hits in, or mental connection being a super fun grapple move. The sheer amount of options you have is incredible, and allows for you to decide how you want to load out Raz and take on the enemies. This opens the door for so much more experimentation than 1, which basically only had a single way to handle enemies. Now you can be an upfront brawler as you grapple between enemies and slow the hard hitters down, or a long-range specialist as you zap enemies and chuck their weapons and bombs back at them, or anything between those. And this wide range of options has also allowed for the last major improvement to Psychonauts 2's combat, which is the new wide array of enemies. 1 only really had 3 enemies, with the basic sensors, heavy sensors which just act as enemies that'll take longer to kill, and lastly the personal demons, which are kinda just awful to deal with and will always manage to deal you damage. And all of them are dealt with in the same way, just Psy Blast or punch them. But now in Psychonauts 2, you have a wider array of enemies to deal with, and they're all very different from each other. You'll have a new type of heavy hitters with the defensive judge, to supportive enablers that defend others, to the better explosive enemy with bad ideas, to blazing fast panic attacks that are a blast to fight, and just so many other types of enemies. Each sports their own strengths and weaknesses, and require you to think fast on how to deal with the current lineup of enemies you may have on the battlefield. You'll constantly be kept on your toes and switching out psychic powers, or finding unique ways to use the ones you already have. And just, God, it feels so dynamic and fun. All of this comes together for a combat system that is so quick and perfectly paced, allows for a ton of player freedom in how they want to play, and asks them to think about their moves to take out enemies with wildly different strategies. I can't put into words how fun this combat system is. It's just so good and meshes with the platforming to make for a truly seamless experience that switches between the 2 perfected styles of gameplay. And all of this is done to explore the minds of the characters better. So, let's finally dive into those characters and the story of Psychonauts 2.
I hope you don't mind Poppins.
Psychonauts was always a game that had more to say beyond the first one. It left so many mysteries and little plot hooks to be picked up, such as Ford's battle, the history of Raz's family, the Psychic Six, and of course the kidnapping of Truman Zanotto that led straight into Rhombus, which gave us a new mystery of the greater scope of the action. Psychonauts 2 had a lot of puzzle pieces to play around with, and questions to answer. It doesn't fumble with these or waste our time either, as it knows what we want from this story, and dives straight into the mystery of Maligula and what's happening with Psychonauts HQ. I sadly cannot discuss the main plot too much due to spoilers, but I will say that it manages to answer everything from the first game perfectly, and the questions about Ford and Raz's family are explored in a way that makes the characters involved so much more interesting than they ever were before. And the way the plot lines of this game, from the mole to Ford to Raz, all intersect with each other into the finale, is just so perfect and leads to an ending that is much more satisfying and conclusive than that of the original game. The whole game is very focused on expanding the existing world of Psychonauts. Instead of just shoving us into brand new things, instead answers questions such as, who are the big heads of the Psychonauts? What's the rest of Raz's family like? And how did the Psychonauts form? Characters like Hollis and the members of the Psychic Six feel like they'd be right at home in the first game, and have very intriguing stories of their own to tell. Not to mention, each of them is absolutely brimming with personality. Each character in this game is such a joy to interact with. The main cast of this game still has that Psychonauts wackiness in some places, but they have a lot more depth and nuance than the Whispering Rock Kids, or some of the Asylum patients. Each of them is extremely memorable, from Hollis's no-nonsense mentoring style, to Compton's exaggerated yet still relatable anxiety over everything, to Psyking just being perfect and amazing. These aren't just funny caricatures of people or issues anymore. These are real people fighting their demons, and you get a real sense of who they are, how they got there, and how they fit in with the world and other people. One thing this game does miles better than 1 is how connected things feel now. In the original, you got a bit of that with Sasha and Mila, along with your fellow kids in the summer camp, but in terms of the later minds of the game, they're all very isolated and disconnected from other characters, unless you count Oleander's influence on some of them. But in Psychonauts 2, nearly everyone knows each other, as you're not exploring random patients' minds anymore, but members of the Psychonauts who have worked together. This especially applies for the Psychic Six, as you get to know them and how they all really saw each other. All their little dynamics, their falling outs, you get to know it all here, and it makes the world feel much more alive than it did in 1. It ends up making all their little stories that much more memorable. These characters and the overall game still have the same charm as the first one, with absolutely fantastic writing that brings in witty comedy that is a trademark of Tim Schafer's work. I'm not the best at describing comedy, but this game is an absolute riot at times with its humor. It has so many little jokes, whether it's in the conversations with the characters, in the visual design of the world, or in the cute and clever ways it frames things with the mental theming, with stuff like half-a-minds and nuggets of wisdom. It has a unique sense of humor that never fails to crack me up. But this light-hearted tone is now perfectly meshed with a more serious and genuine heart to it all. The characters are no longer mostly jokes, and instead hit hard with really emotional stories, both in their individual roles and the bigger tale they fit into. The game treats these with genuine weight, and knows how to hold off the jokes and silliness in these moments. I never got emotionally invested in many of the stories in 1, with the possible exception of Mila, but I did for nearly every character whose mind you explore in 2. Each character feels surprisingly human. You can really understand the problems they're going through and have gone through in the past. The levels themselves also do a much better job of telling their story, not only through world design, but much more explicitly for most of them in what are usually very creative sequences. It manages to be more direct without losing that sense of cleverness the first game had. And these parts of the characters being less hidden allows for one to connect with them much more easily, and thus for their stories of guilt, self-doubt, isolation, and loss to hit much harder. This plays into a big change that really does make Psychonauts 2 a lot better, and that's the level of care it puts into portraying mental issues this time. As much as I love the first game, it sometimes did a tactless job of portraying certain mental disorders in a way that was borderline offensive. I mean, we have a man with schizophrenia who's characterized as a crazed conspiracy theorist and also arsonist, along with making the bipolar ladies stage as mechanic, literally just switching their mood between happy and evil. Not the best, to be honest. But for this installment, they actually did their research and reached out to a mental health expert to represent these issues much better. Through this, they've managed to handle certain topics with much more care, while not sacrificing creativity or even humor. We still get these wildly unique representations of these issues that can be hilarious at times, yet they don't at all feel patronizing or dismissive. As someone who deals with a lot of mental health problems, it felt like the game is no longer laughing at people who suffer from this, but laughing with them, while also hitting the brakes on the humor for certain things. Not only is handling it all with more respect better morally, it also allows for the better stories I mentioned before. The Psychonauts 1 didn't really get the chance to do that, as it was more focused on portraying the issues comedically, which worked in its own right, but not nearly as good as the more balanced approach of 2. It does just really surprise me how a game like this can handle such issues with real maturity at times, and in a way can be a gateway to educating people about the struggles of mental illness and conditions. Double Fine and their consultant did a wonderful job balancing respecting them and also staying creative and funny. But with that, let's wrap all this up.
We hope you don't mind pop-ins.
Psychonauts 2 is an absolute triumph of a sequel. One that not only gives us more of what we love from the first game, but goes on to improve everything and fix what didn't work the first time around. While the first game was a good time, mostly carried by creative and witty writing with its colorful cast, the second has all that now also with tight platforming, outstanding dynamic combat, and a real heart to its story. This is a game that some thought would never happen, and more thought that if it did, it would never live up to the expectations. I can't blame people for thinking that after all the delays, and how other Kickstarter projects to make successors or sequels ended up as total flops. But Double Fine managed to pull through with some help and delivered upon everything they promised to give us. I've done my best to not spoil anything in this review, so that if anyone wants to play it, they can hop right in without having anything ruined. Seriously, if anything in this review sounded remotely good, pick up the game. It is a bit pricey due to it being for modern consoles, but it is more than worth the price. Unless this year gives any other big surprises, this is absolutely my game of the year right now. A perfect mixture of amazing psychic platformer gameplay and a story that utterly captured my mind in a trance. It's a nearly flawless package. I hope more people pick it up and spread the good word. But that's all for now. See you all in the next video, wherever that takes us.